Welcome again, guys. This is Dr. Adil Alzarooni, and we have a story from the East this time. We are honored to have Mr. Eric Wong, a family that has started many years ago in industrials, moving into electronics, moving into financial services. Quite an amazing story. I'm very thankful to you, Eric, for joining me today.
Thanks for
Some
having
of
me.
your time. Can we get a bit of history?
Absolutely. My grandfather started a chemicals business in Shanghai in 1918 with US partners, making and importing dyes for the textiles business. He moved that business to Hong Kong in 1950, and to this day we still do not dyes, but still other types of chemicals, mostly additives for the plastics industry. And then my father joined. He was the youngest of my grandfather's 9 children and sort of fell into it. And he then expanded to get us into semiconductors and electronics. His business model was generally joint venturing still with mostly US partners, large corporates who needed a local partner to establish manufacturing, distribute, engineering, etc. And it was a model that worked fairly well because even in tough times, the large corporate would not allow the joint venture to fail. But at the same time, in good times or at some point, they would also buy you out because they became localized already and they just buy you out. So we ended up selling most of the industrial assets in the 90s. I remember the last thing we sold was a joint venture with a US company called Molex, which makes connectors. And that was bought by the Koch brothers. And that was it. Turned in the shares, and that was the last kind of joint venture asset in the space that we unloaded. And by the time I was trained as a biochemist, I worked at the FDA for a very brief stint. And then I went home to join the business, but there wasn't really that much of a business left because it was mostly sold.
Would you have sold it if time goes back?
The way it was set up, oftentimes it wasn't our call.
Understood.
Because the large corporates would have taken us out eventually. And so we set up a family office in 2003, and first 10 years we're allocating mainly to hedge funds, liquid strategies. We had a heavy bias towards liquidity and also some trade finance, private credit strategies. And then 10 years on in that process, we sort of decided that we weren't really great allocators and we would rather, or I certainly wanted to build a business. So I spun out a high-frequency trading options market making firm between Shanghai and Chicago, trading US equities, Japanese equities, and also doing mostly commodity options market making out of Chicago. And along the way, we also added into this some trade finance strategies. At first, we were invested in funds. We thought we learned something and we decided to do it ourselves. And over the next 10 years, basically the theme is my grandfather did chemicals, my father did electronics, I did finance. And so we would circulate mainly in those 3 areas. And to this day, the unifying theme behind all of this would be we're looking at providing equity for working capital driven businesses with a very specific criteria, but that can be generally, these types of businesses would exist across any industry. And so that's what I do now, but I'm operating this mainly on my own and not so much as a family office per se.
Okay.
Yeah.
What caused you to start growing your own strategy on the public market?
I'd say the returns were so-so. I think but the biggest thing was really the learning was not accruing at the rate we wanted it to, or I wanted it to. And I thought I had some ideas about how things should be done, got to know some insights, but in the end, you're one step removed from directly acting, learning, and building a business, basically, again.
I would have to say that once I hear such an interesting point, and I don't see many that would actually give me that feedback, but that's exactly what happened to me in the sense that once my team got into doing it ourselves, like we got on our own, like Bloomberg terminal
Yeah.
and all of these guys, I started understanding the world much better. You know, it's like I'm there with on daily basis, understanding what happens with currencies and where is the interest rate going and what would that mean in real life. And a lot of these aspects, I was a step away removed, and I couldn't accumulate that knowledge also. And it was always a black box to me. So I totally understand where you come from. I mean, not to say that it's a strategy to be followed, but definitely the knowledge aspect of it. Yes, you're always a step away, and I totally understand that. So with that being said, could you share, you know, how is the family itself? I mean, are they still involved? Do they talk? What do they value? I mean, how do you govern that? Would you be able to share some of that?
Absolutely. So the way my grandfather set up businesses was basically with friends, with family, with a mix of, it was always a mix of people. And they just kind of, four guys sitting around, set up a business and the good old way, four friends. And over time, of course, 2 generations later, it is now our generation's responsibility to clean things up. And I would say we tried to do bits and pieces of that along the way to mixed degrees of success. But now, you know, it's kind of imperative because people don't even know each other now. Like 2 generations, you don't even know these people. Some of them we've never even met.
Wow.
They're shareholders in some of these businesses we've never met. And we send dividend checks out and, well, I hope somebody got it. It got cashed, but I don't know who it went to. So it's at this point where things need to get cleaned up. So that's also what our so-called family office, what it is now being deployed to, is really cleaning things up and going forward now as what's left of this nuclear family. Myself, I have one older sister, and my mother. And so it's a very small crowd, right? And I have one son who's 6 years old. There isn't really necessarily a family business or something to pass on in that sense. It'll be up to him to decide what he wants to do in his life. And I remember my father did mention this, that, you know, it's better to leave your kids a name and not money.
Interesting.
Because if they have the name and if they're competent, they'll usually be able to at least make a living and maybe even more.
So basically what you're saying is that as a family it grew so widely, and probably a lot of them went their own way and doing and evolving, whereby there is the communication is not as you'd probably prefer. Whenever I have a discussion with families, a lot of them refer to somebody that was gluing things up. Did the family miss on that?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think we really had that glue. If there was anything, it was probably my father. Because he was the nexus of all of these things, and he lived till he was 96. So all those years, he was just a rock there. And he'd always send out dividend checks. So everybody kind of coalesced around that to some degree. But we also saw on my mother's side, less functional family dynamics, where my grandmother passed away and this maternal side, and she didn't have a will. So then that led to a whole series of this inheritance issues and a lot of messiness, let's say. So really on that side, we don't really talk to the other side anymore.
Got it.
But
which doesn't help, basically.
Yeah, but I think within our nuclear family, we are 4 people who are completely different. There was almost very little that probably couldn't agree on anything. But I guess but ultimately there was definitely a mutual respect. But we acknowledged that we were very different people.
Are there lessons learned already whereby in the nucleus family there are different structures or like governance or an understanding of how to keep things together, or is that still not there yet?
Yeah, I think one thing was that unlike probably a lot of the other families, the businesses that my grandfather and father built, they sustained themselves to some degree, and to some degree more in memory than in existence as a business. But so what ended up happening was, as to some degree as middlemen, that business doesn't really carry on for a very long time. Either the environment changes or you get bought out or something. You stayed semi-liquid, but you also did not generate that. We never seriously went into real estate in Hong Kong, which is an interesting story that we're Shanghainese, like my mother and my father are both Shanghainese. You'll notice that not many of the real estate oligarchs in Hong Kong are actually really almost none that are Shanghainese.
Okay.
Because they had just fled Shanghai where they lost all their property.
Okay.
They weren't even thinking they might necessarily stay in Hong Kong.
Okay.
Let alone have the balls to then go and buy land the way. So it was really the Guangdong, Cantonese, Chiuzhou, the guys, they were the ones who really are all the oligarchs.
Okay, got it.
And they had the balls to go in when there were protests and so on. They just leveraged themselves up to the hilt and just bought land across.
And that worked.
And it worked very well, obviously.
Yeah.
That's kind of a curious observation that the Shanghainese, they didn't end up going into real estate.
Understood.
Yeah.
Such an interesting story. Where do you think the future is for the family? I mean, how do you foresee it?
Yeah, I think I would say it's simple in some sense, that I can't help myself from wanting to build certain businesses, but I have pretty much no intention that my son would end up having to get involved with them. I would want them to be very clean and tidy and existing in their own right, and non-familial in the sense that it becomes a proper kind of corporate structure. There is no kind of family succession necessary within that.
You want to avoid that?
Want to avoid that.
Is it because of the stress you went through?
No, I just think that I don't want to leave that as a requirement or a burden on my son.
Okay.
He should choose. He likes classical music and the piano. At 6. So if that is his thing, that's his thing. I'd love that. It would be very nice to have an artist in the family.
Okay.
And with no necessity that he would have to even sit on boards or something.
He'll probably go the route of trusts and all. Yeah, so
something like that.
Okay.
But I think what I was fortunate to have was over time built up a group of people where we've worked together 5, 10 plus years together in the various misadventures or adventures I got involved in. And so these are people who are tried and true, battle hardened over time. We work together well. That's my partnership. It's like, you start a law firm with some partners and it will exist beyond you. And you don't necessarily require your children to go in and be lawyers. And yeah.
If you have a time machine, you can go back in the history of the family. What would be the couple of things that you would have loved to change?
There's a part of me that would say I wouldn't change anything.
Okay.
Because I have made so many mistakes. That would be, I could probably cry on cue. Just thinking about all the mistakes and how much trouble I gave my father because of these stupid mistakes, which was, I was just too young. I didn't know what I was doing. So, and why I wouldn't give that up is because that's how learning is done.
Yes.
And so, very early on, I made mistakes in energy markets that cost a bundle. And then what did I try to do? Well, we set up one of 2 exotic energy options market makers to kind of say, like, I learned a lesson, at least sort of. And then I made yet another terrible mistake of leading some partners and buying a bank in Germany. And this was more recent. So I'm still making mistakes, clearly. And that has been a complete nightmare.
I'm trying to buy a unit there and it's stopped.
Yeah. Let's say like Boffin and I are not necessarily the best of friends.
Got it.
But then, I could then point to anybody who's in private credit and say, well, you couldn't have made a bigger mistake than I have, but you also may not know enough as much about European banking regulation as I as intimately as I might know. So these things are just, I would say if there was that time machine, then I would probably, setting aside the business aspects, spend time with, that's it. That's really the only thing you might want to change. The other things, you're learning. Hopefully you're learning.
How about, would you have changed the dynamics in the family, in the wider family? So would have, added any value, you would think?
No.
No, not really, yeah?
No,
So
we were always we always were just this nuclear family. There was this broader extended family, but really we were only close to very few of them.
Okay, got it.
It was really always
Is it
this
more of a
core.
cultural thing, or is this the dynamics of the family?
I think this was just four very different, somewhat unusual people who ended up just
Doing
having
things
this.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It was
Okay, interesting,
hard,
very interesting.
hard to explain.
A word of wisdom.
Diversification is a little overrated and mastery is a little underrated. So you need to really, that's why I think like you, I wanted to be involved, even if I wouldn't, I wanted to strive to be the best at some aspect. And even if I failed at that endeavor, just participating in that endeavor, I would know so much more than an allocator. And where's the fun? The fun is kind of there in the learning and the making of mistakes, building a team. And so that when you come across a future opportunity, you've got the people, like you've got that band of brothers and sisters that you've done stuff with and you can call on them. And that's what makes the next venture successful. It's always the people. That's always what my mother said was, whatever the technology, it always still just comes back to people.
Yes,
and if you don't have that ability to move people and motivate them and create teams, well, what do you have?
I couldn't agree more. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Mr. Eric. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
A lot of your personal experiences and your wisdom. I am sure it will add a lot of value to a lot of people listening to this podcast. And I look forward for another session with you at your convenience in Hong Kong. If you're ever
Wonderful.
If I'm ever there. I've never been there.
Oh, no.
Just at the airport.
Looking forward to our next chat. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate it.
Cheers.